its rule-making and implementation. One of the reasons why we are at this point is a failure to have a critical mass of people in government or parliament who have private sector, let alone small business experience. The irony is, to get less government in small business, we probably have to get more small business in government. As you can appreciate, this is a much bigger agenda and horizon than choosing between Julia Gillard, Tony Abbott, Kevin Rudd, Coalition, Labor or the Greens. Looking at our current House of Representatives, only 14 of the 150 members have been business owners, and that's a pathetic 9.3%. Another 31 have some experience in business, bringing the combined tally to around 45. That's only 30%. Thus, 70% of politicians decide on laws that impact the private sector but haven't had any significant experience in the private sector. It's not that everyone has to be a small business owner to have a wise head, but the imbalance is stark. Fixing it is needed to structurally improve outcomes and the disconnect between our community and its parliament. And faced with this mobilisation, smart political parties will find pathways to get small business people into government. And the same goes for the senior executive and managerial tiers of the public sector, as well as tribunals and agencies, some of which, such as the Fair Work Commission, exercise enormous power. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Small Business Too Big to Ignore campaign now has attached to it the big four you can't ignore. 1, cut down on the red tape. 2, simplify the tax system. 3, make it easier to employ people. 4, build better infrastructure. Amidst the turmoil of national politics, this is a positive message, a unifying message. I hope that all political parties and candidates will take the big four and run with them. We will be asking them to do just that. In fact, I'd love to see a sensible bidding war between our political parties and political leadership on how they will back in the private sector and small business with deed and not just word. Not everything can be done at once. I know this is a choppy period for the Australian economy and for governments to commit additional funding or reduce revenue. That's why some of our recommendations don't cost much and others are investments for the future as and when the economics stack up. The beauty is that backing in small business is not a selfish call. Small business prosperity is shared by the community because small business is central to local communities and the Australian way of life. For the sake of a healthier economy, better government and stronger communities, these issues need to frame political debate, not the politics of personality and power we so unceremoniously have dished up to us. They must then become the central operating principle for the next Australian government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Anderson. Time now for our usual round of questions from our media members. The first one today is from Colin Brinsden.
Colin Brinsden, AAP. Mr Anderson, given your thoughts today, are you happy that with the Coalition's tactics of keeping a vast bulk of their policies under wraps until the election and just giving a sort of broad outline of what they may or may not do, aren't they just creating more uncertainty for business? Or is the fact that they are just not Labor enough?
Colin, what I'm interested in is not political tactics. The small business community is not interested in political tactics. We're interested in what the political parties who form government and want to form government are going to say is their agenda for the next Australian government, and we want it to be an agenda that is coherent and putting as its central operating principle the imperative of respecting and valuing and growing the private sector and small business. So the timing at which political parties put out policies is a second and third and fourth order issue to what they're actually going to do if they form government, and that's what we're focused on.
Shane Wright.
Mr Anderson, Shane Wright from the West Australian. Just going through the four policy frameworks, you've suggested a cut in payroll tax or its abolition, which in the case of the WA state budget, that's 43.5% of their tax base. You want to trial a small business credit guarantee, which would end up reflecting on the federal budget or the state budget. You want the government to administer the superannuation paid parental leave. You want the superannuation guarantee increase to be offset with an income tax cut, and you also want to build better infrastructure. How can you reconcile all those policies and those positions when you're effectively saying to the government of the day and the state governments, cut your spending but give us more?
Thanks, Shane. Government is about setting priorities, and the budgets of governments are all about priorities. And government needs to get back to some fundamental priorities, first principles. And the first principle is that government has no revenue of its own unless that revenue is generated from a strong, competitive private sector and small business community. So yes, there are some of these measures that will require time and the economics to stack up. And yes, issues like payroll tax involve both state and Commonwealth governments working together. But the objective is very clear. Payroll tax is a tax on jobs. At a time when Australia is needing to do everything we can to prevent jobs being exported outside of our country, we need to stop taxing employment with a payroll tax. And if our political parties don't have a plan to do that, then they need to be held to account. And we will hold them to account. Of course, a state government on its own, with heavy reliance on payroll tax revenue, can't do that heavy lifting inside its own budget. But state governments can, in the words of our big four ideas, start to reduce the impact of payroll tax on the small business community. By starting to reduce the impact, the ultimate repeal becomes easier and more realistic. And then, if we have a proper system of federalism operating in Australia, where state and federal financial arrangements are capable of being sensibly restructured, then we may be able to work towards the elimination of what is a job-destroying tax.
Before I go to the next question from the floor, if I could just pick up on Shane's question. If we cast our mind back to the introduction of the new tax system, ANCE, back in 2000, the introduction of a GST, of course, was supposed to be accompanied ultimately by the removal of payroll tax. It simply hasn't happened. Now, there have been suggestions subsequently that one way of achieving this and other things is simply through an increase in the GST level. Does ACCI have a position on that?
The business community isn't advocating an increase in the GST, and our survey work of business on GST issues is that the business community is divided on that question. And the reason why is because the business community doesn't just want to hand government over a whole heap of more money through the tax system. The government already, the national government already, has a $390 billion budget. Add that to the budgets of the state and territory governments. We ought to expect our governments to do everything they can within their wit to ensure that they are not wasting money, spending money on projects which are no longer required, duplicating costs and expenses, before we start talking about increasing taxes across the board.
The next question from Jacob Grieber.
Jacob Grieber, Financial Review. Mr Anderson, the list of things you've got on there are things that probably people would like to see happen in front of every election. Cutting down red tape gets promised all the time, as does simplifying the tax system, boosting infrastructure spending. I'm just wondering, given the polls tell us that we're most likely to see a change of government, what your view is of how the opposition stacks up on those points. Are you confident they will deliver on those points? And perhaps is the fact that business confidence is so low today a reflection of the doubt that people have in their minds that these things will be delivered?
What we're saying to the government and the opposition is that they need to be challenged and held to account for policies that would strengthen the Australian private sector and help grow the economy and small business. And no doubt there'll be aspects of this that will be a challenge for the opposition party. So it should be. We don't want an alternative government, if they come into government, to come into government without an agenda that is going to strengthen the Australian economy. It's imperative. But equally, what we're saying is entirely beyond simply a political party of one colour or another. We need a bidding war between our political parties on who can do the best thing to allow small businesses to do the natural thing. And the natural thing is to want to grow their businesses and employ people and invest in their local communities. We want our political parties to bring that instinct out and allow it to flourish and bloom. Not just through a government plan or government changing one project and rebadging it as another. We actually want government and government systems and cultures to change. They need to. So, we want to challenge the alternative government of Australia, but we also want to challenge the existing government of Australia. Any of our politicians who seek high office have to understand that there is a mobilisation out there inside the community where the people who are creating the wealth of the community want to create that wealth but not have governments simply put their hands in their pocket and redistribute it before even some of it's created.
Laura Tingle.
Laura Tingle from the Financial Review, Mr Anderson. On our tables today, there's an ACCI release which includes an article on what business is looking for in the next government, and it also lists 4 things. I gather this was pre-budget, that a new government should implement and what business needs. And the first one you list there is providing for a balanced budget. And I was just wondering why there's been the shift in the 4 items since that time. Is it because talking about balanced budgets is one of those issues that just goes back to what governments do and doesn't focus on what business needs? Or is it that your expectations of both sides are that they're not going to be able to achieve that in the short term? And related to that question, just going back to the point about infrastructure, do you have a particular view about how that big infrastructure spend should be financed? Should it be just a matter of facilitating private sector investment, or is it a big investment that government has to make, possibly with debt?
Thanks very much, Laura. The need for the Australian government to get its financial house in order and bring about a balanced budget is an important national imperative. And it does need to occur, and there needs to be a clear and credible pathway to do that in the life of the next Australian government. That's an issue for the whole of the economy. That's an issue for the whole of the community. What we're doing in our big 4 you can't ignore issues is specifically drawing out issues of significance to small business. Not that a balanced budget won't work for small business, it will. But we're wanting to make sure that small business issues get the full currency they can. On your question about infrastructure, clearly major infrastructure projects are enormous burdens on the public purse. They can also be significant burdens on the private sector purse. We've seen some major infrastructure projects in Australia developed through public-private partnerships. We've seen some developed wholly through government investment. And we've even seen some infrastructure projects developed purely through private money. Delivering major infrastructure projects is going to require, firstly, the government of the day and the governments of the day to understand an order of priority, that spending money on some small-scale projects or spending money on things that are not going to provide a mid to long-term economic reform is not the best spend. So government has to lift its horizons so that it organises its